Because I come on a verse like this, and again, I'm tempted to just say, here's the verse, we need to love one another and move on. But as I know that this verse has been coming, and as I've brought this together with many wonderful conversations I've had with you, and as I've thought about culture, and I've thought about how, we can't just use a word like love and expect that we all know what the world we're talking about. What is Christian love? To what extent do we read our own understanding of what love should be into that idea? I've been doing a lot of interesting reading about different cultures, and it is interesting how different cultures, they understand love in a very different way. They express love in very different ways, and it made me think about how we in our culture express love, how we understand love. And to be very honest with you, I've got a little bit of an agenda here because I've thought, and I've had conversations with some of you specifically about men. And I want to kind of give you a glimpse into the struggles that we have as men expressing love for one another. And ladies, you can extrapolate that into struggles you have in this culture for having love for one another. Let me tell you kind of what I'm thinking about. Men, ladies, you say of us men, we tend to think in like 16 colors. I think that's a very generous estimate, frankly. I meant about 8. I think men see relationships kind of the same way. And when I hit this verse, I came to a screeching halt, and it really made me think about men and how men have a lot of barriers to relationships with one another. How do men have meaningful relationships with one another? Just as we see, just those 16 colors, we look at relationships and we see enemy and friend, and that's about it. We don't see all the numerous shades of colors that maybe other people do, or shades of relationships. We tend to see enemy and friend, and sometimes we have a hard time pushing beyond having a meaningful friendship, a meaningful Christian relationship with another man. So I'm sitting here thinking, how do we apply this idea? What are some of the hurdles that we have when two Christian men want to have meaningful love for one another? And even just saying it feels a little awkward because of those cultural barriers. Because you have friendship, and then there's another category beyond that, which I won't state too explicitly because of our little ears in the audience, where I'll just summarize it by saying inappropriate male relationships. You know what I'm saying? And this might sound kind of silly, but we get nervous that if we as Christian men start moving in this direction, we see it as a continuum that we're moving dangerously close to somewhere where we don't want to be. Because culture has constructed these very artificial categories for us. And the irony of this category of inappropriate relationship, which culture foists on us, is that this category, which is supposed to bring men together, actually has the opposite effect. It alienates most men from other men who don't want to look like we are in that category. And I think that's a very serious problem. It makes it very hard for men to relate to one another. And I think men need to be leading in this verse. Not just with our wives, not just with our kids, but with one another. Our language doesn't help here either. Women can have, and I don't know exactly at what age this stops, but women can have girlfriends. Women, that goes all the way up.
Yes,
Okay. Women can have girlfriends with other women. That's entirely appropriate. Men cannot have boyfriends. Okay. Isn't that interesting? Women can have BFFs with other women. Best friends forever, or BFFL, best friend for life. Guys, we don't do that. We just don't do that. I have, other cultures, and some of you would probably know this better than I do, other cultures, male affection is very demonstrative in such a way that would make us very uncomfortable, frankly, in our culture. But our culture says men are kind of, detached You know, you look at the stars, you look at the rappers, you look at these guys, and they don't smile. They're emotionally, they're passive, they're impassive. They're emotionally detached. And this is what we have been told makes a cool man. And it makes it very difficult for us to look at a verse like this and to say, how do we love one another in a meaningful Christian way? And I'm struggling with this, frankly. Some of us who consider ourselves a little more enlightened, some of those guys will engage in a ritual with another guy called the bro hug. We'll do a bro hug. Ladies, you do not understand the very strict list of mores that govern the bro hug. Okay, this is, I know we're doing this to make it look like but this is, the bro hug intends to minimize physical contact as much as possible. Okay, we'll shake and then kind of lean because we don't want to, maybe we'll do a chest bump. One of the rules of the bro hug say you can pat, but you can't hold, okay? This is,
no more than 3 seconds.
No more than 3 seconds. And you can squeeze uncomfortably tight, but you can't squeeze too, you know, you can't squeeze. If you squeeze, you grunt to send the message to the squeezee that the squeezor has the right intentions. This is very difficult. And I'm trying to make fun of it, but it's hard. Here's what I'm trying to say. When we look at this verse 11, and thank you for letting me talk about that for a while. When we look at this verse and we say, love one another, I imagine that 80% of what one guy thinks of when we think of loving another guy, 80% of that is culturally driven rather than biblically driven. Does that make sense?
Yes.
I think when I say I am supposed to love another man in a godly, appropriate Christian way, I think I find myself stumbling over all kinds of ridiculous cultural obstacles. Worried that if I do this in the wrong way, I will look like I'm in this category, or worried that I might send the wrong impression to another man. And isn't it interesting that we have this external pressure that dictates for us what love should look like? And we're tripped up by all these cultural phenomenon rather than allowing our love for one another to be biblically derived, biblically driven. Though I don't mind the bro hug. It's just a quick and then you're off and then move on. And I don't have an answer to that right now. Other than I will suggest, if you're thinking about this, I will suggest something, and I want to ruminate about this a little bit more. And I want to see us as a congregation be people who exemplify godly male relationships that are meaningful, that help build one another up, that are reflecting the goodness of Christ in a way that two guys on the same softball team don't understand. They don't have that for one another until they see what we have. The unique love that we can have in Christ. You know, a few months ago, I guess it was before the business meeting, we read 1 Corinthians 13. This passage about love, where Paul interrupts a very significant doctrinal, potentially divisive issue with this treatise on love, what love looks like. And we made the point at the time that, you know, we're going to kind of take it out of the wedding ceremony and put it into its proper context, which is what we did, communion and then a business meeting. And we had a fine communion and a nice business meeting. There weren't contentious issues. However, that's really what it is. It's about the life of the body, not just about the marriage. Now, we can apply it to those other contexts, but it's really about body life. And I would encourage you, men, take a minute or two to look through 1 Corinthians 13 and think about the other male relationships you have in your life. How can you be patient and kind and exhibit the kind of qualities that 1 Corinthians 13 talks about regarding love with those other guys that you come into contact with? I will say this, and maybe this is just my hang-up, I don't know if you other guys have these cultural barriers. It's really fun to see some of you guys and the relationships that you have with other guys that is that are obviously overcoming some of those cultural barriers. I would like to see the rest of us do that a little bit better. Women, I don't know what unique cultural barriers you have, but I hope this little digression has gotten you to think about that as well. To what extent are the multiple degrees of relationships that you have with other women culturally defined rather than biblically defined? And you know what? The Bible has quite a lot to say about relationships. John is just giving us the basic idea about love here, but certainly from John and Paul and Peter and other writings throughout the New Testament, we have a lot of understanding about how people should meaningfully interact with one another in a way that helps build them both up for the benefit of Christ's kingdom. I need to address one other issue, and again, thank you for allowing me to tangent a little bit, but I think this one maybe hits us a little closer to home. And this issue as it relates to this verse, what does it mean to love one another? This issue I've had many of you come talk to me about. This thing about privacy, about the privacy of the pastor, the privacy of the priesthood, this idea where we kind of put artificial
barriers,
doctrinal barriers around ourselves and insulate ourselves from one another. And I know this is going to be contentious, and I know I'll probably get some people unhappy with me about this, but I think we have to be very careful about a doctrine like that really has very little biblical background to it at all.
Amen.
Thank you. Yeah, and you know, that's that's the refreshing thing. A lot of you have come and said, we've got this thing that we've been hanging on. I don't really think there's a lot of biblical support to that. And I affirm that. There isn't. There are verses, and I've looked at some of these. There are verses in the New Testament, 4 or 5 at least, and I'll read 1 or 2 here for you, that talk about don't meddle in other people's lives. I think the problem is taking those few verses completely out of their context and using them to construct a doctrine that creates artificial barriers between people.
Amen.
Those are exceptional verses. They're not normative verses. 1 Peter 4:15 is one of these. Make sure that none of you suffers as a murderer or a thief or an evildoer or a troublesome meddler. Interesting that meddling to the degree that Peter's referring to here is on par with thievery and murder.
Wow.
I mean, I think that's interesting. So he's talking about something very troubling and disturbing and invasive and non-normative here. He's not talking about Christian love, the way we interact with one another. He's not saying, hey, listen, privacy, man, you keep your distance. There's a line, you keep on that side, and we'll have a nice relationship, but you stay out of my business and I'll stay out of yours. That's not at all what's being said there. You know what? And this is a little pet peeve of mine. If you're going to construct a doctrine, it's always better to use biblical terminology. Because, people say, well, there's verses about gossip. And that's the genesis, that's the origin of that privacy of the priesthood or privacy of the pastor or privacy of whatever, is those verses about gossip. Well, then you know what? Develop a biblical theology about gossip. What does the Bible say about gossip? What are the results about gossip? How does the Bible somewhat define gossip as far as you can tell? And I'll give you a good verse to get you going. 1 Timothy 5:13. And probably the key verse for that doctrine, taken out of context. Here's what it says, 1 Timothy 5:13. At the same time, they also learn to be idle as they go around from house to house, and not merely idle, but also gossips and busybodies, talking about things that not proper to mention. So look at that right there. The verse defines this gossip, this meddlesomeness, this idleness, talking about things not proper to mention. Develop a theology about gossip, how to recognize it, how to avoid it, what is the ramifications of gossip. Develop that biblical doctrine of gossip and theology of gossip so that you know how to avoid it. And I think this is a good verse for that, talking about things that are not proper to mention. If we're talking about anything other than that, however, I think we're talking about Christian love. A meaningful